moderated by my colleague and co-author Niels Simon. My name is Maro-Louisa Schulte. I work at Adelphi. I'm an advisor there, and I work on issues related to global environmental governance, and in particular, I focus on chemicals and waste issues as well as plastics issues, which is why together with my two colleagues, Per-Olof and Niels Simon, we replied to the request by the Nordic Council of Ministers for the Environment and Climate to prepare the report that we're launching today. Since starting the work on the report, I think we've come a great way from initial desk research and our own ideas and being up in our little ivory tower. And then we opened the discussion together with about 20 members from different disciplines and also from all around the globe who were part of the advisory committee and who greatly helped us shaping our ideas and gave us inputs, and we were able to discuss it and restructure it. And I would like to issue many thanks for this once again. Before we'll hear more about the report, I would like to make the obligatory housekeeping announcements, which is, first of all, this event is being streamed via YouTube. I will ask Sven to post the link in the chat box at the moment, and it will also be published on the website. And the recording of this meeting will be put on the marinelitterhub.com website. Secondly, I would like to, at this very moment, to ask you to get a little active and to open the chat box and to, if possible, post your name and affiliation in this chat box so as to give everyone in this webinar a little idea about who else is present with them, because in a virtual format that's not always very easy, and we'd like to create that sense of being here together. So if you could quickly use the chat box, open it and just quickly post your name and affiliation, that would be great. And lastly, for our panel discussion later on, we would like to ask you not to use the chat box, but to restrict yourself to the question and answer box, the Q&A box, which you also find on the lower bar of this window, and where you have the opportunity to vote each other's questions up. So for example, if you think that someone posted a question that you would really like to see answered, you can push the button next to the question and vote it up, so we definitely see it. We look forward to your contributions. Thanks in advance. And now I would like to hand over to Ms. Pernilla Allen, who is the head of unit in the division for chemicals in the Swedish Ministry of Environment. Also, Pernilla is the vice chair of the ad hoc open-ended expert group, the AHEC, that was established by UNEA. And last but not least, she's been part of our steering committee in preparing this report. Pernilla, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. A very warm welcome and a very good morning, afternoon, evening, colleagues, wherever you are in the world. I'm very delighted and honored to speak to you today at this launch of the Nordic report, Strengthening the Global Science and Knowledge Base to Reduce Marine Plastic Pollution. Firstly, let me show my gratitude to the authors of this report. This report will be a valuable contribution to the global policy discussion on joint efforts to address the issue of marine litter and microplastics. We currently live in a world which is experiencing a pandemic, but there is no time to wait and see. Reports are showing that with no changes to current production, consumption, or waste management of plastic, by 2040, plastic pollution in the ocean will triple. Science is showing that plastics not only have a negative impact on the marine environment, but also the environment at large and the climate. This is an acute crisis that we need to address in a coordinated manner with concrete and effective measures. Sweden believes that a global agreement on plastics that addresses the whole life cycle of plastics is the concrete, comprehensive, and effective global response needed to tackle this issue of marine plastic litter and pollution of microplastics. We were very encouraged to see the growing levels of support in favor of a new global agreement at last year's meeting of the UN ad hoc open-ended expert group on marine litter and microplastics. At this point, over 2/3 of UN member states have publicly called for exploring an agreement. And the Nordic countries have expressed a clear ambition of launching negotiations for a global agreement at UNEA 5. We therefore hope member states will decide to establish an intergovernmental negotiating committee at UNEA 5 in 2022, so that we are able to find a solution for the challenge we face. A global agreement includes, of course, several different elements and mechanisms. And also talking as an ecotoxicologist, a scientific mechanism is a very important mechanism in any global agreement. Science provides decision makers with factual information so that decisive and effective measures can be taken to tackle environmental issues. Many have voiced the need for a stronger global science and knowledge base for plastic. And as a response and continued support of the global discussions, the Nordic Council of Ministers for Environment and Climate requested a report to explore how to strengthen the science and knowledge base and to ensure evidence-based policy making. So I'm very happy that Adelphi took on the challenge to develop this report. And I very much now look forward to the presentation of the key findings and recommendations for further action, and also the discussions amongst the distinguished panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pernilla, and may I say it was a pleasure working on the report. I would now like to give the floor to, as I said, our lead author, Per-Olof Busch, who has joined Adelphi as a senior researcher early last year. And before that, he has spent many years in academia working at the University of Potsdam. Per-Olof, may I ask you to give us an overview of the report? Thanks.
Of course. Let me first share my screen. So can you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. So also from my side, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm very happy to introduce you in the next 15 minutes to the report, Strengthening the Global Science and Knowledge Base to Reduce Marine Plastic Pollution, that I have co-authored with Louisa and Niels, and it was generously funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers. Also, my thanks to the Nordic Council of Ministers for Climate and Environment. So what was the background and what were the objectives of this report? The background is kind of obvious. So the negotiations of a global agreement on plastic pollution are increasingly gaining political momentum. And in the context of this development, also requests were raised to strengthen and improve the knowledge base on marine litter and microplastics. We pursued three basic objectives with this report. First of all, we wanted to make a case for a global scientific mechanism on marine litter and microplastics. We aimed at identifying the conditions that would make this mechanism work effectively. And the report also serves to inform policymakers and stakeholders about the key requirements, specific design features, and institutional options of effective science policy interfaces. The report proceeds as follows. We start with an introduction where we outline the political context and also the basic structure. In chapter 2, we substantiate the need for a global scientific mechanism on marine litter and microplastics. We highlight the key benefits and identify the key functions and outputs of effective science policy interfaces in global environmental governance in general. We also assess in this chapter the strengths and weaknesses in the existing landscape of scientific mechanism and bodies on marine litter and microplastics at global and regional levels. And against this background, we derive the expected benefits as well as the desirable key functions and outputs of a possible global scientific mechanism on marine litter and microplastics. We review the key requirements, the specific design features and related practices that make existing science policy interfaces like the IPCC or IPBES work effectively. We transfer the insights from this review to a global scientific mechanism on marine litter and microplastics. In chapter 4, we discuss and compare core features of 3 options for the institutional setting of science policy interfaces, their main advantages and disadvantages, and their implications in the context of marine plastic pollution. The conclusions, as usual, wrap up the main findings. 3 key messages stand out. So first of all, the existing global science and knowledge base on marine litter and microplastics warrants political action across the entire plastics life cycle. Second, there is a need, and I will go into more detail why there is a need on the next slide, for a global scientific mechanism on marine litter and microplastics in order to strengthen the global science and knowledge base and improve the scientific policy advice across the entire plastic life cycle. The last key message is that, in our view, in terms of effectiveness, the decisions about the design of such mechanisms are overall much more important than the decision on its institutional setting. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of existing mechanisms on marine litter and microplastics, and why do we think that there is a need for a global scientific mechanism in this area? The existing mechanisms have, to a very large extent, consolidated the scientific knowledge on the extent, sources, pathways, and effects of marine plastic pollution, including what is known and where the knowledge needs to be improved. Overall, these assessments, or the assessments that have been published so far, agree that there is a sufficient knowledge to warrant action and further research. Yet, this landscape of mechanisms, if I may say so, also features some weaknesses. First of all, the landscape is highly fragmented and insufficiently institutionalized. There are substantive gaps in global and regional assessment reports. For example, there are too few regional assessments. Often the assessments lack a comprehensive life cycle approach. They mostly ignore knowledge on problems, for example, in the upstream stage or the pre-consumption stage of the plastics life cycle. They neglect knowledge on policy responses, on effective policy interventions, and they are characterized by, let's say, rather large inattention to sciences other than natural sciences. We also observe a limited exchange between scientists, policymakers, and stakeholders. This kind of exchange, which usually characterizes scientific mechanisms, is barely institutionalized in the area of marine litter and microplastics. It's often more ad hoc and a one-off exercise. We also observe that there's only limited access to the knowledge, data, and information that these assessments use. They lack regularity and they also lack coordination. Overall, the status quo weakens the authoritativeness of global and regional scientific knowledge assessments and impairs the effectiveness of their scientific policy advice. What are then against this background, desirable key functions of a global scientific mechanism on marine litter and microplastics. We highlight 5 desirable key functions in the report. The mechanism should promote the use of life cycle approaches to marine litter and microplastic in all its activities. It should try to consider the regional heterogeneity of the problem. It should strive for increasing the coherence and consistency in the approaches to the knowledge assessment at global and regional levels. It should also try to improve the two-way exchange between scientists, policymakers, and other stakeholders, for example, by better institutionalizing it. And finally, it should provide easy access to scientific knowledge, data, and information by establishing a clearinghouse mechanism. What are desirable key outputs of possible global scientific mechanism on marine litter and microplastics? We think that it should provide 2 kinds of periodic, global, and possibly also regional knowledge assessments. On the one hand, it should provide comprehensive assessments that cover all stages in the life cycle of plastics. And on the other hand, it should also provide more specific assessments that focus on selected aspects, for example, on individual stages in the life cycle of plastics, upstream, midstream, downstream, and in particular, in our view, on the effectiveness of policy interventions, as we observe that there's a lack of knowledge assessment in this area. The mechanism should also try, to the best extent possible, we know that it's kind of difficult, to harmonize and standardize the methodologies to monitor and assess the extent, sources, pathways, and effects of marine litter and microplastics at global and regional levels and across all stages in the life cycle of plastics. It should also try to harmonize, or at least to provide some guidance to regional knowledge assessments, thereby promoting comprehensive and specific assessments, as I have just outlined before. And finally, the mechanism should aim at identifying or at providing knowledge assessments on effective mitigation strategies across all stages in the life cycle of plastics. What are key requirements of such a mechanism? So, well, in the literature, there are 4 key requirements, and I will briefly run through them. The first key requirement is that such a mechanism should strive for credibility by facilitating transparency, openness to potential critique or diverging views, and scientific independence. This is usually done in the existing mechanisms by an appropriate selection of relevant experts, by an independent peer review, by the separation of scientific and political processes and outputs, by an appropriate access to and use of knowledge, data, and information, and by transparent rules of procedure. With regard to a global mechanism on marine litter and microplastics, the selection of experts would best, or that's at least our view, we would recommend that it includes scientists from all relevant disciplines and not only natural sciences, and holders of local and indigenous knowledge with a view to regional representativeness. The second key requirement is legitimacy by including to achieve legitimacy by including a broad range of scientists and multiple stakeholder groups. In the existing mechanisms, this is usually done by including by increasing the inclusiveness as regards holders of scientific, indigenous, and local knowledge, and also by enabling to the best extent possible the participation of knowledge holders, policymakers, and stakeholders in the production of outputs and also in the decision-making processes. Again, with regard to the to a possible global scientific mechanism on marine litter and microplastic, this means that the mechanism should use and give equal consideration to knowledge from all relevant sciences beyond the natural sciences that still dominate this area, and relevant local and indigenous knowledge. Second, the mechanisms working and decision-making processes should be open to the scientists from all these relevant disciplines and all other relevant knowledge holders, and allow for their broad participation. The third key requirement that we identified in the literature is salience and relevance. This is usually achieved by a broad participation of relevant actors in the production of outputs, by outputs that are tailored to the needs of target audiences, and by the development of communication and outreach strategies. Last but not least, the current state of knowledge emphasized that, in particular, such global scientific mechanisms work effectively, that provide some agility. And this is usually ensured by establishing a built-in review mechanism and by allowing sufficient flexibility in the scientific work to adapt to changing circumstances. With regards to the global scientific mechanism on marine litter and microplastic, this means that the build-in review process should enable scientists to identify, bring onto the agenda, and quickly respond to newly emerging issues. So what are the options for the institutional setting of...
Per-Olof, if I have to hurry you along, Alyssa, we've already
stretched I'm almost
all right. Done. Thanks.
There are three, maybe I don't describe them too much in too much detail. There's the intergovernmental panel, which is established through a separate and independent international agreement. We have the scientific body under a multilateral environmental agreement, or a scientific mechanism under an international organization. The main advantage of the intergovernmental panel is that it has the highest independence from other institutions. The main disadvantages are that it incurs the highest administrative and organizational costs, and that it needs to overcome widespread reluctance of states to create new institutions. The scientific body under an agreement or an international organization feature more or less the same advantages. They are highly responsive, or more responsive, to the needs of policymakers and stakeholders, and they lower the administrative and organizational costs. They also feature disadvantages in case of the scientific body. This is that it requires the prior adoption of a multilateral agreement. And in case of the scientific mechanism under an international organization, this is that the funding is less reliable and suitable. And as I said, maybe I conclude with this, that the decision about the institutional setting, in our view, is less influential on whether the mechanism is able to perform the key functions of an effective science policy interface. This depends more on its mandate and the specific design, and the decision on the institutional setting is above all a question of political priorities and aims. And I stop here and hand over to Louisa.
Thank you, Per-Olof, for this great overview. Let's now just very quickly, without further ado, move on to our panel discussion. And as I said, questions are also invited in the Q&A box. Let me hand over to Niels. Niels is a political scientist who has been working on chemicals and waste issues for more than 10 years now. And shortly after joining Adelphi 5 years ago, Niels has started to openly call for an international agreement on plastic pollution. And as we can all see, he's still active in that research field. Niels, over to you.
Thanks, Louisa. And before we move over to the panel, I just want to reiterate that if you want to bring in questions, please use the Q&A box, which you should be able to see at the bottom of the Zoom window. And also all participants should be able to upvote questions that others have posed. So this would give us an indication where your preferences and priorities are. So please make use of that, and I'll forward any questions that are upvoted to the panelists. Before we go to the panel, though, we'd like to ask you a question. In a second, a survey question should pop up asking you where you see the most urgent needs to advance scientific knowledge on plastic pollution and governance. Please note, though, that you can only pick one, so you really have to prioritize. However, since there's about 100 people participating here, we hope this gives us a good overview of where your preferences lie. And I'll give you 2-3 minutes to read through the question and the answers. You're all fast reading and clicking. About half of you have already voted, and a picture begins to emerge. So now 2/3 have voted. I give you another 10-15 seconds. All right, I think that should do it. 70% have voted. Approaching the 2-minute mark. All right, so let's finish this and have a brief look at the results. We see quite a clear picture with a quite large number of people having voted for that a scientific mechanism should look at transformation pathways and strategies for a sustainable circular plastic economy. Quite a broad effort that needs to be undertaken. This is followed by assessment of the sources of plastic pollution and pathways of plastic through the environment. And that's followed by the effects of plastics and additives on human health. So I think this gives quite a good picture of the broad questions that you as participants feel a mechanism should be able to answer, or at least should be dealing with. We did force you to only pick one. Maybe the picture would change a little bit if you would have been able to pick 2 or 3. For example, the response options just got a very few answers, but also the impact of marine litter you did not see that as a priority need, at least for the time being, and at least not is you're forced to pick only one. But thanks a lot. I think that gives us really good overview over what you're thinking. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce the panelists, and I would like you, Thomas, Julia, Ayub, and Takayuki, to fire up your camera so that we can all see you. Brilliant. All right. So let's start. I'll introduce the panel, and then we go give them a series of questions, which they will answer in a kind of rapid fashion to also give you as participants an opportunity to weigh in as well. So Thomas Mace is a senior scientist at GRID-Arendal. He has an educational background in civil engineering, biology, and marine science. He specializes in marine litter, microplastics, hazardous substances, waste, and wastewater. And he also developed an extensive knowledge of waste governance, environmental institutions, and organizations. And over the past few years, Thomas has led a range of ocean-centered research projects, and he was a member of various panels on marine pollution. Next on the panel is Giulia Carlini, joining us from Peru, I think, today. She's staff attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law, or CL. Giulia works on chemicals governance and endocrine disruptors and has been dealing with plastic pollution also for quite some years now. And among others, she closely followed the ad hoc expert group established by UNEA. Third on our panel is Ayub Macharia. He works at the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources in Kenya. Ayub is Director of Environmental Education and Awareness. He's an expert in science, teaching, and communication, and has, among other things, closely followed plastic policy development in Kenya. And last but certainly not least, we have Takayuki Shigematsu. He is Deputy Director at the Ministry of the Environment in Japan. He's working on waste management there and also an expert on marine plastic pollution. So welcome to the panel. And I'll start in this order with asking Thomas. Thomas, in your view, what will be the key features of a strengthened science policy interface on marine plastic litter and plastics pollution? And I'll just say this once to you and to everyone else, asked you beforehand, and we'll just repeat it quickly here. Please be brief because there will be 3 questions to all 4 panelists. So Thomas, please, what will be the key features?
Thank you, Niels, for the question, and welcome everybody, and thanks for inviting me. I think that a faster feedback mechanism is certainly something that I would appreciate. I think we often find ourselves running behind the facts. So a more rapid response where we, in a quickly evolving world, can also capture some of the newly emerging issues would be definitely a key feature. I think transparency is another one that I think should be included. So we should definitely have a clear definition of the roles, the responsibilities, but also make sure that we have a strict conflict interest policy. We should also have some rigorous peer review processes in there to make sure that we can at least make it transparent for everybody and everybody knows why we're doing it. This also means that we should make it inclusive and organized. So we should definitely think about all different disciplines, but I would also like to have different genders, different regions, and so a voice for everybody. By doing so, we will be able to successfully integrate scientific data, but also make sure that social sciences and local knowledges are included to actually produce some policy relevant information, which is also usable in the field and can be applied immediately. There is a definitely need for a communication approach, and it's something I've seen as a scientist quite often. The science is strong, but often we miss the whole kind of aspect of how can we communicate the science and create some awareness. It should be actually a main aim and not some side kind of task that we pick up. The communication should be one of our priorities, because by communicating it well, I think we can achieve quite some progress. There are some good examples of other kind of intergovernmental bodies, and I think about the IPCC one or the IPBS one, where we can learn quite a lot from, because I think this will allow us to strengthen the policy making, and that's what's needed, I think. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. Short and to the point. Giulia, what is in your view, what will or should be the key features of a strengthened SPI?
Thank you, Niels, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I'll also be quick, and I think one of the main points is also coinciding with one of the findings of this report, which is the focus. So we started this whole process at UNEA focusing on marine litter and microplastic, but I think we moved on from there, still acknowledging the very, very heavy impacts of plastic pollution in the oceans. We've also seen how it's crucial to have an approach and a focus that is across the life cycle of plastic. And the report refers to this as a pre-consumption phase. So I think it will be very, very important to consider this part, to consider science, starting from the extraction, the manufacturing of plastic, because we know that plastic pollution starts on land, and the marine impacts are just the last chapter of the life cycle of plastic and of plastic pollution. I also agree with several points mentioned by Thomas and also the findings of the report about being inclusive. So we need a scientific mechanism that includes not only scientific natural scientists, but also social sciences. And as the report identifies knowledge holders, I think this is the key. So it's not just about the knowledge, but also the people. So in this case, there's a need to include not only traditional and indigenous science, but also indigenous scientists and indigenous people. There's a need to have a sort of balance in gender and also regions, because we've seen in the findings how some of the results, the scientific results, also vary depending on the region. So these could be ways of making the scientific mechanism more relevant and credible and also effective in its outputs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Julia, for this overview. Next now around is Ayub Macharia. Please, what is, in your view, necessary key features of a strengthened SPI?
Thank you. I think in addition to what my other colleagues have said, this issue of timeliness and being up to date is very important. Some of the interventions that have been done in many parts of like Africa, data is missing to inform the actions that were taken. The data that is there is quite old or reported from another context, not our context. And so we need up-to-date data, which is context related, so that we are able to act based on our data, or data that is near us in terms of space. And the science policy interface would also be useful. One of the features is the issue of being able to illuminate the gaps in terms of knowledge and data, whereby we need to know what is there, what is missing, so that people are contributing to specific gaps. And then when we generate this information, the way we present it, it should be simple. You know, policy makers require simplified information. So science has its way of communicating, but then also the target being the policy makers, even our young children who are supposed to act immediately, their books, the way they are taught, it needs to be simple enough. And one of the other things is that we have learned, especially here in Africa, in Kenya, when we are implementing our plastic bans, is the issue of trade-offs. What kind of trade-offs are available? You remove this, so what will be replacing it? What will fill that gap? So the issue of alternatives is very important, so that we don't, as we demonize the marine plastic litter, we also provide alternatives because they are there because they are useful. The other aspect is the issue of methodology, standards, very important, so that all of us are able to apply the same yardstick in our gathering of the data. And also the issue of access, whereby we need to make sure that there is that smooth flow of information from one layer to the next layer. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ayub. And to make the round full and complete, I'm very interested to hear the perspective from you, Takayuki Shigematsu.
Hello, thanks for inviting me. This is Takayuki from the Ministry of the Environment, Japan. For this question, I believe that one of the key features for strengthening science policy interface will be to consider a broader range of scientists, policymakers, and multiple stakeholder groups to contribute for this work. This consideration can help to gain credibility and legitimacy. Depending on location or the background, issues people are facing and knowledge people are having will be quite different. Therefore, it will be appropriate for the science policy interface to allow broader point of views for wider range of the stakeholders. In this context, the digital platform for marine plastic litter established by UNEP this year is designed to have involvement from wider stakeholders, including academia, business, and government. One of the options to utilizing this kind of existing framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Very concise and to the point. Now, the second question I'd like to put to the panel is, what can we learn from other processes and where do you see challenges? And actually, I want to do a different order this time. I haven't told the panelists in advance, so they will stay very much awake. And I'd like to begin with Julia. What can we learn from other processes? Where do you see challenges?
Thank you, Niels. Trying to respond to this question, I'd like to be brutally honest and oversimplify a little, but I think the first lesson learned, especially coming from the chemicals and waste angle, which is the one I've been working for the last years, is that good science doesn't automatically mean good policy. And of course, by being good, I'm oversimplifying, but I want to say that even when we have very, very strong findings, these don't automatically and immediately translate into policy action. So this is probably one of the main challenges, making sure that there's a tie, a strong tie between the findings that we can have with this science policy mechanism and action. And so this could also be reflected in the way we ensure that the mechanism is really strongly linked with a potentially new convention or treaty on plastic pollution. Then also, I think there's a risk that science is manipulated and that there's misinformation. So we've seen that with tobacco, we've seen that with climate, we've seen that with hazardous chemicals. So there are misinformation campaigns. And it's also timely for scientists to try to respond to these critiques or to websites that seem legitimate but are actually spreading misinformation and manipulating sciences. So this is something that we really need to be aware of, because when there are vested interests, there's also a risk that science is manipulated. And so a solution for this could be to really dedicate more resources and empower scientists to have stronger links with policymakers, to educate policymakers. Also, how some of my predecessor panelists responded, making sure that conflicts of interest are prevented and managed, and also that there's a simplification of what are the scientific findings, so they're easily understandable by policymakers. And here I think it might be useful to work a lot with journalists. We've seen how media are also very important in translating scientific findings. And maybe lastly, I'd like to say that one of the future reports of the UN Special Rapporteur on toxics and human rights is actually going to tackle the right to benefit from scientific progress and its application. This report is going to be presented at the Human Rights Council in September, and I think some of the findings of these reports and recommendation might be also very useful to this process.
Thanks a lot, Julia. And handing over to Takayuki Shigematsu, what do you think? What can we learn from other processes, and where do you see particular challenges?
Yes, the report mentioned the various examples of global scientific mechanism, and it's apparently seems that there is no perfectly well-balanced mechanism. Therefore, we should fully utilize the lesson learned in the report when we design the scientific policy interfaces, as well as the established global scientific mechanism on litter and microplastic. The challenge to meet the key requirements, design elements, and practices of an effective global scientific mechanism to have a balance between credibility, legitimacy, salience, and agility, as suggested in the report. Related to the point I raised in the first question, having participation from a wider variety of experts, policymakers, and stakeholders is challenging, as there are usually knowledge gaps as well as gaps in understanding. We truly think that the capacity building is the better solution as a feasible and relatively easy way to fill in the gaps. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Looking at Thomas, what do you think? What can we learn from other processes, and where are challenges?
Thanks, Niels. I think it's not new. I think the international community has quite a long history with concerted actions. Most of them have been in chemicals and waste, but I do think we can learn a lot from what has been done before us. There's quite a lot of multilateral environmental agreements which are already in place. There is quite some IGOs which are working on processes to control it. So I think if we look at those, one of the major lessons we learned is that we need a good marriage between science and policy. It should be a very close relation. It should not be one who dictates the other, but it should actually be feeding off each other. So science should inform the policy developments, but policy should also incentivize some of the scientific research to answer some of the questions they have. I think there's often, when in my field as a scientist, I can often see that we have more knowledge and we could actually address some of the questions better, but often we don't get the voice. We don't get asked, or it's not even considered sometimes to include us. So I think that a multi-stakeholder dialogue is definitely something that I've seen that works. And you can see examples over the past from the 1960s when the Silent Spring and DDT was highlighted and how that evolved to the Stockholm Convention, to acid rain, to the hole in the ozone layer when I was small was one of the big things, and how CFCs got regulated. So I think there's quite some good lessons to be learned. There are also some things we could avoid and which we could definitely see to avoid in this new one. It's the gaps and the lack of coverage we have created by sometimes working in silos. So we have a lot of conventions, however, still very small compared to the totality of the chemicals and waste and issues that we have. So there is not that many. They're often very limited and they're very focused on each of their own little details. As a result, they're very boxed in, and so they actually act by topic, but they don't really interoperate very well. And so that leads to delays or lack of information, or sometimes even integration and misrepresentation. And so I think that we should definitely try to avoid this if we put something in place again, that it's not outdated and it's not already boxed in before it actually becomes useful. So it should have definitely some horizon scanning or some early warning mechanisms, because often we just do compliance monitoring and we run behind and we try to follow something up that's already been banned years ago. So we should have more investigative monitoring, I think, because otherwise we just create a new dinosaur. That's how I often refer to some of the conventions as dinosaurs. And I think that we can actually avoid it by probably involving the scientific community. It's been said before, but I think the whole science policy is actually a science field on itself. And I think that's often misrecognized. Even my son often, when he looks at me, he says, but you're not really a scientist, Dad. You don't even have a laboratory. And so I think that it's actually one of the crucial things is that science policy field is a science field on its own. It's very difficult to bring it. And it's something that helps. And I think that others have missed, or other conventions could do better, is that communication side. We definitely need a better communication between what is the demand, what can we offer. A good example is often there are some policy targets which are being put in place. We're going to have 25% reduction, they cry out. But often we can't even measure those differences. And so I think a better kind of dialogue will definitely help here. It should be taken into account in the future, I think. That's it.
Thanks, Thomas. Before I give Joep the word here in the round, I'm looking at the clock and I see that we have a bit less than 10 minutes. So I think I will give Joep the last round for this question, and then I'd like to take at least one or maybe two questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A box. There is already a few questions there. Put in some more if you want to use the upvoting function, and then I will forward those to the panel. But please, Ayub, you have the floor. You're still on mute.
You want me to answer question 2 or 3?
2. What can we learn from other processes? Where do you see challenges?
Okay, thank you. Now about the other processes and challenges, we are happy that we already have many conventions on environment which we are implementing, and we are party to, and we have generated a lot of information, a lot of data. Of course, learning from them is that the challenge that is reported mainly is the issue of lack of resources, capacity, infrastructure. They are the ones which are hindering the science policy interface, but the convention is already there, and we are doing well. Now, other processes, what we have learned is that the issue of linkage with people is so important, because plastics, people have a lot of attachment to plastics. And we realize that, like in my country, although there is a ban, we still fight the plastics getting in illegally. That means there is a market, there is demand, and this needs to be understood. And so our science policy interface should bring out this linkage with people in a better way, so that we are able to understand why the people have gone to an extent of even bringing the polythene illegally into the country, and also the issue of disposal. There is also something, the people issues around disposal, which make people just to throw them anyhow, is also important. But we also appreciate the challenges that are there, in the sense that the linkage with people is so intimate, such that like in some places, some of our policymakers, they are not willing to take action because they argue about jobs, about money, and that is a challenge to us. Finally, this issue of best practices, very important that we also bring out in our science and policy. Our other processes have taught us that if you want to succeed, you need to report or start from who has succeeded in whatever you are saying. However, we have a challenge in the sense that best practices are a few. Sometimes you may not be able to have enough best practices, especially at the beginning of public awareness. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayub, for these insights. So we have about 5 minutes left before I hand over to Ingeborg for some closing remarks. So we can't do the third round of questions, but I'm looking at the Q&A box. There's just a few messages, comments, and questions. So starting with Johanna Eriksson, who put a comment rather than a question, saying she's in favor of moving the marine plastic data upstreams to land, which draws on a point that Julia also made. We should not forget that also sea-based activities use plastics, with a big risk of ending up in the marine environment. That's for sure. And the other question coming from Peter Kershaw, who asks, what are the biggest political challenges that will need to be overcome before sufficient acceptance of an agreement can be achieved? Now, this is not specific on the science policy interface. I assume it's rather focusing on the plastic agreement as such. So I would move this forward at the very least to Ingeborg later on, but also given that these are the questions that were in the Q&A panel, the opportunity to either say something to the plastic agreement, or rather provide, like, in 1 minute, very short answers. In answer to the third question, how can a global agreement assist to achieve these functions that you just outlined that are necessary for a science policy interface to work and to bring the field forward, starting in the original order with Thomas.
Thank you, Niels. I'll try to do them all three in once. I don't know if that's going to work, but let's try. First of all, Johanna, I think she's absolutely right. I don't think we should actually make silos again and put stuff in land-based, sea-based. We are living on one globe, so it should be seen as that. And I think this global agreement should maybe even be expanded to just even chemicals and waste to just encompass the whole of the plastic life cycle, because basically plastic is still a polymer plus additives and it's a chemical kind of compound. So I think it might even be wider than just talk about sea-based and land-based. I think we might just talk about chemical and waste as a whole, and in that have plastic and marine litter and microplastics and all the rest. For Peter, I think that one of the main issues is making it inclusive, but without duplicating. We have to avoid any kind of duplication, so we should make sure that we find a faster, responsive way to deal with this international policy development, and we need to nest ourselves in existing structures. The other option would be to patch up the existing conventions, but I think that would take too much time and too much renegotiations. So I think here we could probably think about a sort of an overarching governance body which could help and maybe makes it more acceptable. I think that's one of the possibilities. And then how a global agreement will assist, well, I think I kind of answered that with Peter, but I think there are some elements which I mentioned before, like the horizon scanning and the rapid response assessments. That kind of stuff is definitely needed, I think, to assist the global agreement and increase participation of the scientific community. That's 8 in 3.
Thanks, Thomas. Hand over to Julia. Just please 1 minute, otherwise we run over time. Julia.
Thanks. So it will be very difficult to answer to all these questions in 1 minute.
Pick one.
But I think one of the ways to better link this science policy mechanism and the new plastic treaty, hoping we'll have one, is making sure that we have very, very clear goals and processes, and that the findings of the mechanism are really tied to the political answer. So it's more difficult to ignore them. And we've seen with this report that actually there is enough existing science to warrant political action. And so in this sense, I would say that using the precautionary principle, and maybe in this sense, we also link it to the question about zero waste, having this prevention and precaution approach when we tailor policies might be a way of being more effective in the new treaty and with the new policy responses.
Okay, brilliant. And in time, Ayub, 2 sentences.
Thank you. I think the global agreement will be useful, especially to help us in strengthening the linkage between upstream, downstream connectivity, and the need for interventions in both places, and then bring out the need for all of us to be involved, nobody to be left behind, because you are on either the upstream side, the downstream side, you need to take care of each other. Thank you.
Thank you. And Takayuki, final words from the panel.
Yes, the movement toward the global agreement may assist to clarify the mandate and the design for the science policy interface, and to help the discussion whether or what types of institutional setting will be appropriate for the further discussion. However, as I mentioned in the first question, there's a possibility to utilizing the existing framework such as UNEA and the multi-stakeholder platform established by ENEC to play a certain role during the negotiation. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot for the panel, for rushing answering all these questions in a row. And I'll hand over to Ingeborg Mohr-Knudsen for closing remarks from the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment. Ingeborg, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Niels, and huge thanks to Adelphi, all our esteemed panelists, and also to GRID-Arendal for hosting this launch today. And it is clear that there is a strong need for scientific information to assess the extent and effects of marine plastic pollution. And this has been identified by the United Nations Environment Assembly and others at numerous occasions. And today we heard interesting feedback from the polling and the panelists. We did see a large number of responses pointing to the transformative action that is needed for a more circular economy for plastics, but also get more information and knowledge on effects on human health and the sources of pathways in plastic pollution. Also, access of timely and updated data, the need to harmonize methodologies and standards and to build capacity was mentioned. And we also heard the importance of a two-way dialogue between various stakeholders and the need to involve people. And to address the gaps that we see today, it is clear that we need to prioritize our efforts and target our measures and policies to be most effective. And in order to succeed with that, we need to have the best available science and knowledge to inform our actions. And that is why a strengthened science policy interface will be an integral part of a global response. The Nordic Council of Environment and Climate Ministers want to be an active part in the global policy discussions addressing this environmental issue of our time by providing various knowledge products. Last year, we launched the first Nordic report on possible approaches and elements of a new global agreement on plastics pollution. And this report that was launched today is as such the second Nordic report. So we have now started our discussions on the way forward on what might be an effective response to address plastic pollution across the entire life cycle of plastics. We also heard today that there is significant fragmentation, that we need a clear mandate and design for a new approach. And we also heard that there is a need to take a multidisciplinary approach and least but not last, to have broad and inclusive participation. As such, I think the report and the discussion today have provided a number of relevant messages, but that the most important take-home message is that it is the design of the mechanism that will be the most significant. And these are, of course, important messages to carry forward in our deliberations. We hope to continue these discussions as we progress towards the next part of the 5th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, where it is the Nordic ambition to establish an intergovernmental negotiation committee towards a new agreement. So I encourage you all to stay connected, and thank you all for joining us today. Please visit the website by GRID-Arendal, marinelitterhub.com, to get more information. And finally, about the report, read it, use it, share it, and stay connected. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.